Hey everyone, back again. Today we're continuing on with Michel Foucault's The Archaeology of Knowledge, covering the entirety of Part 2, which covers from Chapter 1 to Chapter 8, where Part 1 was the introduction. Weird choice, I know. But before jumping into it, you know the drill. Go watch Part 1 if you haven't already. It'd be strange for you to be here without having listened to that. Consider donating to one of the organizations below if you have the means to oppose the Israeli apartheid regime, which has been, since my last recording, established by the International Court of Justice as being an apartheid regime. So please do what you can to contribute, to be involved. Any little bit helps, just as this kind of help, the kind of boycotting, divesting, sanctioning was required to push South Africa to end its apartheid many years ago. So I want to give you the broad strokes here to jump into it, of the first part, or the second part, of Michel Foucault's The Archaeology of Knowledge. This is where he's going to lay the foundation for what we know to be discourse analysis. It's a very fancy term, discourse analysis. It's one that you'll find in many academic circles. You read academic theses or dissertations, you'll often see discourse analysis being employed, and I mean, correctly so. So you should get a sense of what discourse analysis actually is, and I'm going to try to make that really clear here, because the thing for Foucault, and one of the difficulties of this text, is that he doesn't really do it. He doesn't really do discourse analysis. Instead, and that's not his point here, instead he's trying to lay the foundation for what such an analysis would look like, to give his readers the tools by which to begin recognizing various domains, to then apply discourse analysis that he effectively provides. He lays out what that should look like, the types of things it considers, how it interrogates a text, how it isn't just the search for hidden meanings or the search for hidden intentions within discourse, where discourse here refers to communication. Discourse is all the communication that happens between people. It also refers to those specialized instances, like the specific discourse of a certain field, like medical practice, for example, where if you try to listen to two doctors, like medical doctors, talking to one another, chances are you'll have no idea what they're saying. They've entered a different field, they've code switched, they've entered this new space, they've put on this new face, they've adopted a new tongue, a new language, a new discourse to then occupy that space. And the same happens all the time. No matter where you are adapting to an environment, a linguistic environment. And here by linguistic, I'm not just referring to the written word or the verbally spoken word, but also street signs are a kind of discourse. Other signs that you see, the ways that people interact with one another, where people sit, which people sit where, who gets to occupy which position during ceremonies, for example. I mean, these are all elements of discourse. These are all communicating something to someone or to many people. So that's what he's going to be doing here. Because I find when I do these episodes, like all my episodes, I do a very poor job at just giving you the kind of broad strokes before getting into the specifics. Sometimes I just jump into the actual nitty gritty here, and then you're left being like, well, what is the big picture? I want to try to be better at that now. So as we just saw from the last episode, history has often not done so well with discontinuities, with ruptures, with thresholds, with limits, because history doesn't want to acknowledge that there might be events that don't neatly fit into historical understandings of the past. Because traditional history, as we saw last time, is very content on just homogenizing entire areas, entire periods, reducing myriad minds, thought processes from the lowest class of people to the highest class of people, reducing them to just one homogeneous, uniform, straight arrow directioned group, all gravitating around some similar worldview. And Foucault problematizes this because it's just not true. It's just not true. History only reflects those people whose experiences were the most recorded, really the most simply, and whose experiences historians want to capture, that they want to then repeat. And so there's no coincidence then that most of the people we read about in history tend to be, at least in the Western context, old white dudes. Historically, they've held most of the power, and they are the figures that are the most exalted, the most celebrated in history. But history and historical analysis isn't just trying to homogenize all of history. I mean, that's totally reductive, and please don't think that that's what I'm saying or what Foucault is saying. There are so many different ways in which history accomplishes its goal of making the past manageable so that it can then be studied, so it can be captured in writing or in the written word, and then transmitted, communicated. So there are a few different tactics it adopts. It does that traditional approach, like we said, that is, it reduces like the infinite myriad different experiences into just like the history of this period, or an entire era, which is just to paper over, to gloss over any distinctions, any discontinuities, any ruptures, and to reduce them to this overall period. History or historical analysis is often relied upon influence that tacitly assumes the easy and widespread dissemination of ideas and worldviews, as though once a worldview was actually made apparent at a certain point in history, offered to us by our liberal elite academic types, then people were just super willing to bow down and adopt it. So it's not as though historians were discovering this random occurrence of people all believing the same thing at one time, but maybe you get the more nuanced historians that look at influence, that look at the various ways in which entire peoples were influenced to believe a certain thing. Was that actually true, though? No. I mean, for most of history, the majority of people have not been accounted for. They didn't keep writing. They didn't write things down that we could then study and be like, oh, this is how they thought. And whenever they did, their thought is reduced to, or it's made to fit within the broader understanding of that period. Also, history draws upon ideas of development and evolution that make history a biological process that is living and coherent across its ruptures, discontinuities, etc. And there's a lot to this idea that history is a living biological process, and it is incredibly anthropocentric. It is futurist. It just reduces the complexity of human history to just a singular human experience, where if you take your life, how it is often sold to you is that you're born, and then you go through various phases, very much regimented phases, and eventually you die. And historians sometimes look at history this way. They say that, okay, well, we have these phases, we laid them out. History is this developing process that is leading towards perhaps something one day. But what we do know is that it has this kind of organic truth to it that gives it, that lends it its movement, that lends it even its credibility. And it is from there, in its equation with or to the human life process, that history is then bestowed with this, dare I say, somewhat transcendent character. Transcendent in the sense that it moves beyond just pages and words into a living biological process. But that's not what history really is it? Like, if you actually take a moment and think about what history is not so neat as just being like going from infancy to adulthood and then death. Actually, if history was truly practiced, it would be like birth, old age, middle age, birth again, death, birth, old age, middle age, for every single person that is a part of that history. Not even to account for the fact that this idea about the human life process is not nearly as neat as we like to think either. I mean, what is this idea that why do we bestow this kind of linearity upon life, upon our movement through our own lives. It's hardly linear. It's filled with discontinuities and ruptures where we do things and say things and wonder things that we don't even understand. Like, let alone that this can simply be reduced to a kind of linear trajectory that is bound to all living organisms and processes. This Heideggerian idea of being unto death, that we have this singular point that we are directed towards, and it is from there that we actually extract our own motivation for being. Where for Heidegger, we know we're going to die, and it is from that we get up in the morning and do stuff, make community, be with one another, because we know it'll end one day, or there's something we're going to confront that we can't make sense of, so we really want to make sense of the things that we can make sense of. And not to criticize Heidegger, because I don't have the ability to do that, I think things are a little bit more complicated than that. But yeah. And then there's the other historical perspective of reducing history to a kind of spirit that organizes people into a collective consciousness, guiding all possible history, past and future. As though within history, even if we account for all of its ruptures, all of its mysteries, all of its discontinuities, somehow we can find a guiding theme in the very movement of history itself. Maybe not according to a basic biological life process, but within the very possibility of history to take place, we can find some kind of a justification for its study in the first place. And so all historical analyses should then be focused upon this very capacity for change, for development, for spirit. But we're not only interested in history here. He's going after history because I think that it's the lowest, easiest hanging fruit to set the stage for discourse analysis. He's also extremely interested in other fields like literature, politics, science, that we'll come to talk about, and so on. And they all contain their own rules, orders, limits, their own tolerances for discontinuities, their own intolerance for discontinuities, and so many other things, and they don't ever admit it. And discourse analysis, one of its primary goals is to reveal what is often taken for granted in the establishment of a field. So what is actually required for there to be a field like physics? What actually belongs to the field? What is included? What is excluded? Why are some things excluded? Why are some things included? And so on. Like, who is actually, setting out these rules? It's no one in particular, but what historical processes have laid out these rules? Now, okay, asterisk. Pretend as though this is an essay and there's an asterisk. Discourse analysis does more than just be like, oh, it's historically contingent. So discourse analysis isn't being like, physics set up this way because of this event and this event and this event in history, and it created it to be this way. That's one part of discourse analysis, I would say, but it's a fairly small part compared to its overall project, because even explaining things in that way is to submit to another discursive regime, that is history, that is able to just explain away any phenomenon by being like, the past will tell us. The truth is in the past, as though it's this secret zone that is just only gatekept by the limits of our own understanding, that we can then draw from to learn more about ourselves. Or there's the other mysterious phenomenon of the emergence of various fields, and many of these fields that we now view in academia, like from physics and so on. I mean, there was a time when physics and math and astrology, they were all kind of clumped under the banner of philosophy or under the banner of math, or depending on where. And then over time, they began to be separated, where now there are many disciplines, way more than there used to be. So what's going on here? How does anthropology actually emerge? How does anthropology differ from sociology? Like, what rules are kind of tacitly in place to make sure that these can remain separate fields? They don't overlap with one another. They don't infringe on each other. And, the They stick their stake in the ground with their flag, and they're like, this is my territory. And only I, the one with the requisite proper credentials, am able to then participate in this field. What processes go on that we aren't even aware of to make that possible? So how does what is a field? What is a discursive field? Like sociology has its own discursive field. Well, in its most basic form, a discursive field is comprised of texts. Texts, Texts. Texts are the way by which discursive fields are formed, because discursive fields are tantamount to the texts, not necessarily just written down ones, but all of the words and text and iconography and so on used and belonging to that field. But what really is a text? Ooh, that's a tough one. What is a text? Is it just an oral book? What is that? What is that? Is it a book? Is a book a coherent unity of an author's thought? Like, what really is a book? If we pick up our version of the Archaeology of Knowledge, what are we confronted with here? What really is a book? I mean, it's one of those things that we definitely take for granted in just assuming what it means, but it holds a lot of value. There's a lot of stock attributed to a book of this magnitude, Foucault's Archaeology of Knowledge, and that all of its significance actually has nothing to do with it being a book at all. Like, it could have been in any other form. It could have been a PDF on a computer. And you might say, oh, well, this is a stylistic difference. It doesn't actually, there's nothing actually substantially different in any way from that, from it being in book form versus like a PDF or being written down on a napkin or something. And I think that would be incredibly naive to say, given that, if you just look at the academic life cycle now, in order to actually be taken seriously, you cannot content yourself with writing your ideas down on napkins. You have to publish books if you want to have a career. And so it reveals that the book is a lot more than just this neutral demonstration of an author's thought, of a writer's thought. It is actually a regulative mechanism that gatekeeps the proper way that knowledge should be disseminated. So it should be spread through this proper medium, like a book, against which everything else, every other kind of communication, be it radio or television or PDFs online or whatever, are seen as being illegitimate by comparison, even though there's nothing inherently more legitimate than the written word or less than written in another form. But even if we stick with books, like, is a poetry book the same as a novel? Is it the same as a political treatise? Is a religious text the same as Moby Dick? Like, what? You can hardly just say that they're the same by virtue of them being in written form on pages between two hard covers. That would be a very... I wish I viewed the world in such simple ways. But that doesn't get at the heart of what a text really is and the kinds of value that is associated and attributed to the text. So as discourse, the book form, the book itself, is assumed to be a coherent and limited demonstration of something for others to read. However, it also upholds the very coherence of a discursive field in its expression of a litany of thoughts carefully strung together to deliver another thought. And this reveals something of the paradox of discursive fields. If you want to become a sociologist, you get all your degrees and become a sociologist, and then you want to enter academia, and then you're confronted with this problem. You got to write a book. You got to write a book, and you got to come up with something original. So on the one hand, you need to occupy a discursive field. You need to adopt the right sociological rhetoric. You need to draw upon the right sociological figures and understandings. And you need to be familiar with the methods that the sociologist uses, among other things, but these are kind of the big ones. And so you have to do all that while, on the other hand, offering something that is new. But that newness cannot stray too far from the discursive sociological field that we've established. It has to still remain within it somewhat and to some extent, lest it be chastised or cast out, which is often like historically when people have been, only celebrated after the fact, it's because they were offering new ideas that strayed a little bit too far from what the discursive field actually permitted, actually allowed. They're a mysterious thing, discursive fields and the texts that emerge within them, because those texts have to adopt the right elements of the discursive field while also offering something that is new. And the way that this often comes out is that the author establishes that they are familiar with the key authors, key terms, key methods. These are taken to be the kind of grounding for many discursive fields. And then on top of that, once you've effectively established that, your insight is what is then going to push the field. So discursive fields are never just stagnant. They're never just sitting there and they're totally restrictive on what's possible. They permit a certain amount of novelty so long as you adhere to its basic premises. And that is where the policing really takes place in these fields, where the regulations come in and what discourse analysis tries to reveal and tries to make clear. But like, people don't fit into easy categories. I mean, this is something that Foucault definitely experienced when Anglo academics in the United States couldn't understand him because they were limited in their cognitive abilities. They just called him a postmodernist. Same with Derrida and Baudrillard and all those fun fellas. They just reduced Foucault's thought to this thing called postmodernism, which Foucault very much resisted. Derrida very much resisted as well when he was called that. But it was an effort by which to impart an identity upon these people. But it didn't have a kind of organizing principle. It wasn't like a discursive field that emerged organically by coordinated thought among all these thinkers. It was a title bestowed on them, which is why I never use the term postmodern or postmodernist. I think that is total hogwash. I think it's not grounded in reality in any way. But to do that, like that, to even say of any of these thinkers, like Foucault, for example, that they are somehow remain the same even throughout their whole lives to belong singularly to one field, is absurd. Foucault thought wildly different things and wrote about wildly different things that we just neatly erase in favor of just calling him a postmodernist, even though there's no way we can easily clump him into any of those categories. In fact, Foucault can very easily fall into the domain of philosophy, history, economics, I would even say, sociology, anthropology. I mean, all of these things, Foucault could easily belong to any of these groups. And that's one of the reasons why he is such a profoundly interesting thinker in the context of this book, where he was practicing exactly what he wanted us to be aware of. That is, it is possible to expand our horizons, to break through the regulations put forward in various discursive fields to limit what we can actually discuss and how we discuss those things in serious academic prose and serious academic circles, but also elsewhere. And he really lived that. He really approached these things in the way that made sense to him. And there's a great amount of privilege afforded there. Like, not anyone can just do that. I'm very much aware of that. But in any case, I think that it does present the power of exactly what he's talking about. So as I've kind of tried to hint at, to perform discourse analysis or to interrogate discourses, to do more than look for origins. To be like, oh, well, sociology is like this because Durkheim said this once, or whatever, whoever would be considered the quote-unquote father of sociology or whatever. Discourse analysis is not interested in looking for origins as though any discourse can be explained away by pointing to an origin not overtly manifest in the discourse itself, like a kind of beginning point. Because even beginning points we really romanticize and fetishize a lot as like the explanation for why something is the way it is, which is only, I mean, and psychologists love to do this too, like the reduction of your entire life to your experiences in childhood, as though, and we love to submit to ideas that, oh, you hit 25, your brain stops developing, at that point you're just this kind of static mass, incapable of growth and development and developing new deep emotional connections, understandings of the world and yourself, because it's not in childhood, which is like, life's a lot more complicated than that. A lot more complicated than that. So discourse analysis isn't looking for origins. In fact, it's actually trying to look for newness. It's looking for those moments in which a new idea enters a discursive field, and then the discourse analyst is like, wow, okay, what allowed this new idea to belong to this field while also claiming to be new? Like, what's going on here? Or what about that idea over there that's not being included? That new idea, what's going on here? Why is that idea, and why aren't the sociologists taking this up? What's going on? You know, what kind of limiting work is at play here? The point, though, is not to do away with all this, like the search for origins. And I mean, that stuff's cool too. Foucault does it a lot if you read his other books. But to separate them, or at least this is the concern, to separate them from the silent certainty that defines and commands them. We have to move away from that, or the way that we celebrate and romanticize the search for origins, or quote-unquote truth, to understanding a discursive field. So he asks, what are any discourse's limits as to what it permits to belong to that discourse? What unities does it create? What knowledges does it forbid? What does it define, or how does it define proper methods? How is it that one particular statement appeared rather than another? And what allows statements to become intelligible at all, so that a sociologist can look at an idea and think, oh yeah, that belongs to our domain? Very interesting phenomenon for that to happen. And that puts us here into chapter 2, discursive formations. So what really unites a field? In his words, what in fact are medicine, grammar, or political economy, for example? And here he begins to outline how the enunciative function, like speaking, expressing something, how it operates, and therefore how discursive fields work. So belonging to political economy, what really unites David Ricardo's idea about rented property, where I've done episodes on David Ricardo, but Ricardo essentially says, oh, rent is a fascinating thing. Like, rent should go down for the worst land while going up for the best land because it's easiest to work on, and so on, where if effectively the worst land actually costs $0, and the most land is determined, its value is determined by the worst land, how much of worst land is actually required to essentially cultivate. So what is the connection there between that idea and Adam Smith's idea about like government regulation or the laissez-faire capitalism? Because in a lot of ways, they're really different. They're really different. I mean, they have two totally different books. You have Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, and you have David Ricardo's something, 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 something. A long title. I could edit this and correct that, but I think it's funnier this way. Whatever. Just look up David Ricardo's some book and taxation and whatever. What actually unites these things? Is it because they both talk about money? Is it because they both talk about wealth or tax? Like, if that were the case, then wouldn't we be able to put alongside Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations? Wouldn't we be able to put alongside Karl Marx's Capital? Even though that is a critique of political economy and is often excluded from the domain of political economy. And we see that today, where economists do not take Marx seriously, even though Marx writes about all of those things and actually offers some of the best insights into capitalism that anyone has ever been able to offer. Like, why aren't we reading Marx? Maybe you're in a department right now where you read economics department, and you're reading Marx all the time and I sound like I have no idea what I'm talking about, that'd be great. That'd be awesome. Good for you. Why is it that then Marx is not included? Or in the terms of medicine, that falls under the rubric of medicine, what really is it that unites a doctor specializing in lung health and someone specializing in brain health or in foot health? How do we actually connect these things? And why don't we then include under the banner of medicine, like social workers who deal with brain health, not in like a pharmaceutical way, but in a, I will just say, holistic way, or in a way that's more relational? Or we can't forget that historically, medicine has excluded the study of the brain as belonging to its domain, reserving that for psychology for a long time. And so here he's going to go into his, Foucault loves lists. Here he's going to get more into the establishment of these discursive formations in 4 different ways, or 4 of the different elements that contribute to this discursive formation. So number 1, perhaps one might be inclined to say that what unites any field is the object it focuses on. So in medicine, what unites the doctor of the lung with the doctor of the brain is the body. The fact that what unites them is focusing on a human body, a human subject. The problem with this is that it assumes that this object is just this static, stagnant, unchanging, unitary thing, as though the body is just this simple, limited thing that we know takes up space and is extended in space, and that is what a body is. But that is to say that somehow there's a body that exists outside of all the discourse that medicine and other fields have used to describe that body. Like, what is this transcendent body that somehow exists outside of all discourse? Because even the term body is a word that we use to encapsulate the entirety of our being. But, if we were just going to be true about that, then we have to ask, why is it that social work isn't considered to belong to that domain? It is dealing with the body, is it not? Yet it is not included there. So we see that it's not nearly as neat as we like to think. It's not like medicine is not nearly as neat or this answer being like, oh, well, what unites political economy is its focus on the economy. Because that's actually not true, because there are tons of expositions into the economy that aren't included, or in medicine, how social work isn't included, or how other, types of medical type dealings with the body aren't included. Or the second possibility, someone might say, or they might argue, that the discourse organizes itself in a common vocabulary, method, and approach adopted by many who are exploring the same themes at once. And obviously this isn't the case, obviously not, because no such harmony exists. How else would we account for the field itself if we believed everyone was saying the same thing the same way? That's just simply not true, that a field is formed by everyone adopting the same rhetoric at the same time, because fields don't just poof into existence and everyone is discussing them in the exact same way, using all the same language to discuss the same things. Discursive fields mutate and change, which is one of the things that discourse analysis finds super interesting. How does it change? In its change, what does it permit itself, or what is it permitted to change to? What is it not permitted to change to? What is it not permitted to include? Not to mention that, the people who actually make up the field, if you look back in the great, thinkers of any time, like Freud and psychology, Freud wasn't Freud because he just repeated what everyone else was saying. Freud was Freud because he pushed the field. But he wasn't the only one. Many people who tried to push the field weren't accepted for it. So what's going on here? Or perhaps someone else, for the third possibility, someone else, maybe a very clever person, might identify a discursive field by the widely accepted use of certain words. For example, in grammar, or grammarian, whatever. In grammar, that widely accepts the meaning of words like noun and verb. But what grammarian has been truly satisfied with the basic concepts alone? Are not concepts negotiated to push the envelope of the broader domain that is always itself being negotiated? I mean, if we just say that a discursive field is formed around the acceptance of very basic concepts, no one would be content with that, because no one is sitting there saying, yeah, you know what makes science is 2 + 2 = 4. And as long as everyone just says that, then we're good. Or like math or whatever, or physics or astronomy. It's like the earth revolves around the sun, basic concept, basic idea. If you said that at a science conference, you'd get laughed out of the room. Not because it's wrong, but because it is so banal beyond the point of even saying. Or someone might say that discursive formations organize around somewhat nebulous themes that unite disparate viewpoints. So, for example, economic theories that share notions about value of money, labor and prices, or anything else within economics. And with this, the physiocrats, who are another group of thinkers in political economy, physiocrats were like, where does value really come from? Well, it comes from the soil, the very basics of what we can provide ourselves, where any amount of labor should be calculated in terms of what you'll get in the form of barest necessities that come from the earth. So 1 hour of work should be worth X amount of food that is required to keep this person alive. There's more to it than that, but I don't have infinite time. But then the Marxists discover that actually value doesn't come from the land. It comes from exploited labor. Because for value to even exist implies that someone's making money. And for someone to be making money, it means that someone is not making money or is losing money. And then with the classic political economists, they locate value in the market, where they say it's a savvy business people who show up at the market and with their savvy negotiating skills are able to just sell things above their value and create wealth, as though that is how wealth is created. But this explanation then effaces itself in its recognition that these things don't map onto each other super easily as to what actually unites them. What unites the physiocrats with Marx, with Adam Smith and the political economists? What actually unites them? It's not so clear. And as we can see, none of these explanations solve the dilemma that's put before us. However, they do reveal something. It is through discontinuity, dispersion, and rupture that we find regularity. Because any of these fields, from sociology to medicine, is comprised of things that don't really fit. And that is exactly what makes the field the field. It needs new ideas to push itself. So it needs things from outside of it to effectively keep it going. It's kind of like what a vaccine is meant to do, where a vaccine injects a little bit in the old vaccines, a little bit of the virus into you so that your body takes something from outside of it that it is then able to use to grow. But it needs to be done under extremely coordinated and regulated circumstances. You can't just inject, like, there's a sick kid down the street and you take some of their blood and inject it in you so you don't get sick. Or, like, that's not how that works, obviously. I don't know why that was the example I gave. Don't do that, for the love of God. But we know that this is highly regulated. And the same applies to these fields that carefully curate what ideas can be permitted as being new within that field. Because what really is regularity without the irregular? What is, darkness without light? What is cold without heat? How can you actually tell these things apart unless you had the other against which to measure this thing? So what is, even within medicine, what is medicine without the study of ailments? Or with the study of those things that medicine actually can't really understand? And, there's a lot that medicine and doctors don't understand, and that's fine. Like, it's not to knock them. Like, it's incredibly complicated stuff. But one of Foucault's dreams, I think, is if these fields continue, that they open themselves up to more possibilities. He's not using this as his end goal, but but you kind of read it as him being like, maybe they could at least do this, accepting that their fields are not nearly as neatly established and defined as they like to think. Or what is economics without the study of crises? What is grammar without the study of non-standard languages or non-standard dialects or whatever? So discursive formations are then always attuned to what opposes them or what stands outside of them. The way they cohere are the rules of formation. Or I should say they are guided by the rules of formation. So there are rules in place. And these rules, like the discursive fields themselves, are not really neat at all. They just reflect certain interests. And interests are never neat. I mean, people can hardly ever express what they actually want in their lives, let alone be able to dictate how an entire discursive field should work. Same applies to the field itself. However, it will establish rules that aren't necessarily consistent in their application, but nevertheless do the job of carefully delimiting the borders of that discursive field. And that puts us here into chapter 3, the formation of objects. Now let us try and sketch these rules of formation. Let's try and make them a little clearer by looking at psychopathology from the 1800s onwards. Here we are concerned with objects that help shape psychopathology as a field. So he chose the 18th century here because that is when we see institutionalization of the mad, people being sent to mental asylums, and the birth of many concepts still used today, like paranoia or other hysteria, and so on. So he's again going to give us his lovely lists. He loves his lists. So this list is going to break down how psychopathology actually establishes itself as a field. So for a field like psychopathology to emerge, it must narrowly define what belongs to its domain. Fair enough. What topics should be included within psychopathology? What shouldn't be? Indeed, delimitation was all the rage in Europe at the time that was desperately trying to navigate the swaths of people entering cities to effectively work. And in Madness and Civilization, he reveals that rather than the study of and treatment of so-called mad people, rather than that being because policymakers and doctors wanted to help people, it had a lot more to do with trying to rid the world of undesirables, specifically to rid cities that were under a lot of pressure for its people to be productive workers. Some of the first people to be considered mad were people who were lazy. And so they were then pathologized and institutionalized to try and be reformed to not be lazy. But by reformed, I mean just tortured, thrown into a cell with 40 other people where, they don't see any daylight, just absolutely horrendous conditions because of capitalist interest. And then there was also the interest of the church, very interested in having a pure body politic that was going to be free from sin, which is just established through religious texts and dogma. And at this time, when all of these regulations were emerging about having a healthy body politic, a healthy public social body, so too then did emerge the category of the mad person, of the person who is mentally ill. And so it's hardly that this object of psychopathology, that is the mad, always existed, and it seems like it was created to then be something that psychopathology could study. And here I kind of already covered 1 and 2 of this list that he gives us, where the second point is focusing more specifically on the various interests that wanted the mad to be incarcerated or institutionalized. And then the third point that he makes is that once a discursive field has been established, what we've moved beyond here, like the material interest, capitalist or religious or whatever, once now this field has been established, this field is not going to be content with treating its object, like in this case madness, as some kind of homogeneous, unchanging thing. No. Because it never approaches it like that. No, you get the specialist for paranoia, you get the specialist for idleness, you get the specialist for hysteria, you get the specialist for melancholia, whatever. And so there's a vested interest within the discursive field to always imply that it is not enough, that it has more work to do. It can more carefully understand each person, clump them into a narrower and narrower category to apply the best gaze with which to then monitor that person, to keep track of them, to understand them. And this dovetails with Foucault's broader point in the history of sexuality, where sexuality, rather than being repressed, we actually saw within medical discourse an explosion of rhetoric around sexuality. All of these efforts to understand it, to clump different kinds of sexuality into different groups so that they can be more easily managed in them being compartmentalized, in them being very neatly packaged up in their specificity. So to really grasp how a field emerges demands a wide view of the many different people, disciplines, and institutions discussing a given object or phenomenon in different terms, and perhaps with different intents, yet that speak the same language. How, in terms of the treatment of the mad or the sick, which is his topic in The Birth of the Clinic, how academics and policymakers were able to come together in their mutual disdain for sickness and their mutual love of the idea of purity and having pure, controlled social bodies that could then be easily moved, can be easily manipulated in its movement. Or beyond that, how, for example, discourse around the family resonates with penal discourse, where there were various ideas about prisons in its early days in France that tried to establish colonies that would foster kind of family living within prisons, which is an idea that was adopted effectively to try and take the sting out of prisons while also supplying prisoners with what these researchers and what prison people, the people putting people in prison, they believed would cure them. Like, they just need more family. They need more tradition to make sure that they won't commit crimes again. So accounting for these many discourses reveals not how they discover objects of study, but how they create these objects of study. Does a mentally ill person exist before an entire psychopathological regime emerges to understand the mentally ill? You know, if we look at the history, and this is one of his other points in Madness and Civilization, is that actually for a long time, the person that the 18th or the 19th century psychopathologist would consider mad was an exalted figure. They were the secret keepers of wisdom. They show up in Shakespeare's plays as the fool, as the outsider, that by virtue of their privileged position as outsider, are able to then recount events in ways that others are not able to see. So here is revealed something fundamental about discourse. And again, here he opens up lots of questions and doesn't always answer them, because this is tricky stuff. I mean, this was cutting edge for him. So it is revealed that what remains constant among a given field to lend it its intelligibility is not a stable object like madness or the mentally ill in the case of psychopathology. Rather, it is the very unity of the discourses themselves that condition objects to be analyzed and objectified, which then is used as justification for the field to then intensify its gaze over those objects, over those people, over the prisoner, over the deviant, over the sick, over the mentally ill, and so on. And now the point for discourse analysis is not to look at something like someone who is mentally ill and say, oh, or within that field and say, oh, your psychopathology, your understanding of the mentally ill is wrong. Actually, it looks like this. Because to do that still implies that there is, this true mentally ill subject that exists in the world, and that subject is not actually constituted by the discourse used to understand them, as though there's a true thing out there. Because it would be totally wrong for me to go up to the psychologists who treat the mentally ill and say, y'all got it all wrong here. If you really wanted to treat the mentally ill, you'd treat those people who are funding apartheid. Isn't that a sign of being mentally ill? If you fund apartheid, Because that would be something a mentally ill person would do, would it not? But I'm not saying to do that, actually. I'm not saying to put the people funding apartheid in institutions, because the point is abolition. And that would only, to do so, would only be to confirm the necessity of such a discipline to understand the mentally ill. Even though there are people today funding apartheid who are considered sane. And it demands we ask, how do these fields emerge? How do they determine what people belong under their umbrella, are objects of their study, and which people are not? Why is it that when you go onto Google or anything and you type in the word crime, you get some interesting stock photos? How come when you type in the word crime, you never see really represented white collar crime, which is by far the most harmful, virulent, violent form of crime that happens on a daily basis and that affects the most people? Because that's not convenient if that is how crime is understood. No, for crime to be intelligible, that discursive field, like criminology, has to draw upon other discursive fields, like white supremacy, where if you type in the word criminal, Google's gotten better with this now because they weren't good about this for a long time. You type in the word criminal, historically in Google you'd see a bunch of pictures of black men. And it's a problem that they've since addressed. But it reveals, like even within the history of criminology, it often naturalizes this idea that criminality or the study of crime is just also associated with the study of black urban culture, which is extremely messed up. Like it's extremely messed up and goes to show just how much this field is not committed to truth and objectivity in terms of actual crimes and their effects on the people and the world, in which case all the people that were responsible for the 2008 financial crisis would be in prison, but they aren't. So it really demands us ask, like, who's included as objects of study? Who's excluded? That puts us here into chapter 4, the formation of enunciative modalities. So common discourses among 19th century doctors include qualitative descriptions, biographical accounts, deductions, statistical calculations, among others, fancy terms, very fancy stuff. Now, what unites these specific terms and discourses anyways? And who has the right to such discourse, and from where does this right come? The savoir. And here is an important distinction in French that Foucault uses between savoir and connaître or connaissance, where savoir, which are both translated into knowledge, the word knowledge in English, but in French they mean totally different things, where savoir refers to the unthought knowledge that is required to occupy certain spaces. So you go to the doctor, you walk into the doctor's office, you know that you probably have to sit down in a chair and this person is going to examine you. You're not walking into that office thinking you're about to examine the other person. That would be weird. Don't do that. But the reason we know not to do that, and the reason I'm saying not to do that, is because I know how to act in that situation. That's an example of savoir. It's something you just know. Whereas connaissance refers to the specific knowledge that someone has. So you walk into the doctor's office and the doctor starts spouting stuff at you about, I don't know, heart rate and blood sugar and all that stuff. That is their specific knowledge that you are then accepting, you are then hearing. That's an example of connaissance. Or connaître, connaissance refers to a specific body of knowledge, whereas savoir is like the totality of knowledge altogether, like the things you don't even know that make it possible for you to exist in the world. Now, in the case of the doctor, what other things are required that you know to act a certain way in that space? Well, the space itself. It's a very cold, isolating space, white walls, maybe beige if they're feeling squirrely. It's unexciting. It's a place of just objective, neutral observation, as though such a thing is actually possible. I went to the doctor the other day, got my blood pressure done, And interesting moment, they do the blood pressure thing on your arm. And doctor was like, oh yeah, your reading's a little bit high. But it's probably normal. You probably don't feel like really comfortable in this space, meeting him for the first time. It might not be the most like neutral space. He didn't use those words, but that's effectively what he was saying. And I was thinking, I was like, yeah, because it isn't. I mean, what kind of truth? Does anyone ever present themselves truthfully in the doctor's office? Like, you go to the doctor's office and you talk to your doctor the way that you're talking to your buddies or your family? No, that'd be weird. But, like, it claims to be the space that brings out the truth of you, the truth of your disease, the truth of your being, when it is actually does not do that at all. It is just a space like any other that has its own rules and regulations that determine how these things play out. So could it be that hospitals, or the hospital's adoption of, for example, hierarchized observation, among other things, and control also lend it legitimacy in the eyes of a public intent on controlling unruly masses of workers, where the doctor who would observe the lazy person was doing so with the whole backing of the social body who wanted people to be working so that they could then grow industry, and then they could all grow together, at least as they were told, they were promised with the capitalist mode of production. Now, what role does the medical subject play here? They are both a barrier to, effectively, they're both a barrier to and the keeper of secret wisdom that only the doctor must be able to reveal. They must recount the truth of their body that is not their own to effectively be deciphered by the expert doctor. So in this moment between a patient and a doctor, there are an entire constellation of relations at play. There's relations of space, knowledge, health, pain, truth. All of these things are at play. So now it should be clear that discourse is not simply a mode of expression for a free subject. It is the terrain that births subjects. So you become a subject within a discursive field, either to be looked at or to do the looking. And both require different regulations and rules to adopt. So discourse is not just this neutral thing, not just whatever people say and at any time they want to say it. No, discourse is highly limited. You are always limited in what you can say, and how that those, you have to say certain things to even be made intelligible so that people even understand what you're saying, from the language you use to the syntax of that language you use to the specific words you're going to use in certain spaces and so on. And that puts us here into chapter 5, the formation of concepts. How do we account for a specific emergence of a concept in a given field? So a concept, something totally new, a new concept. If we use natural history as an example, we may observe that many of its terms have undergone shifts over the centuries. Terms like genus, species, signs have changed since the 17th century. These terms don't hold the same transcendental status they once did. They develop, like anything else, they change, they mutate as the practices in the field changes. I'm sure you can think of many other examples of like a term that was once used in a field that might stick around but means something totally different today. So for Foucault, concepts emerge or are created according to a set of rules for arranging statements in series to lend them intelligibility. A concept is something that is meant to stand in for a lot of things, not just a single thing like a word. A word, a noun, just stands in for something, more or less. But a concept, something a little bit further, it applies to more than that. In the 17th century, for knowledge to accrue in natural history, it must have pointed to a past, to an established series that the new discovery confirms in its addition to that series. So natural history, in order for it to exist at all, has to have a history from which to draw from to actually understand what is going on. For Darwin to do his Darwin work on evolution, he had to have deep knowledge of the entire history of thought before himself to understand exactly what he was doing and the significance of what he was doing. And even at the animal level, the animals that he was working with, to recognize that they have undergone a kind of change, a mutation, depending on what plants they were around or what kind of beasts they were around, that they had to evolve to accommodate. And this history, while in some cases it's outdated, nevertheless still belongs to that discursive field and serves its own purpose as being that background kind of sediment that, you know, was once celebrated but is now a kind of residue that the current or the contemporary elements of that field try and make sense of to adapt and to change according to the adaptations and changes of the field itself. But remember, such discourse doesn't exist on its own. It must coexist with other discourses that simultaneously confirm the newly adapted methods of observation, data collection, and reasoning emblematic of, for example, 18th century natural history. And of course, this practice isn't specific to that field, to 18th century natural history. We find it everywhere, where no discourse truly exists on its own. Even within the entire field of academia, these discourses mingle among one another. They share terms and concepts and ideas, and even outside of academia, they are then taken up by various regulative mechanisms and regulative institutions like politics, for example, that has a vested interest, for example, in public health. So it will adopt and it actually employ people who are experts in public health, experts in medicine, to then inform itself in how it should arrange policy in such a way as to optimize public health. Because what good is a field if it's only for its own sake? There's truly never been a field where that's the case, where it has only truly been studied for itself. That has never happened. If you can think of an example where that's happened, where there's been absolutely no reference to or pointing to or relevance for some other institution, some other discursive field, I would be extremely surprised. But let me know. Now, there's also the process of adaptation guided by procedures of intervention. If a field changes, its methods and discourses are adapted while retaining their key elements. If a new method is used, as with the transformation of qualitative descriptions to quantitative classificatory tables, then the discourse looks entirely different but remains intelligible to the trained eye nevertheless. So this classificatory tables thing, like for a long time, like species were just described in their singularity almost. And then classificatory tables emerged to then try to find connections between various different species, even within certain species, to find out the limits of their mutations and how they all, like different kinds of frogs, for example, of different species of frogs, how they might look different, they might have different shapes and sizes. The classificatory table will account for all of those, and it's almost a very quantitative thing, account for all of these differences that nevertheless still belong to the same genus or the same species, which it has less to do with us actually truly describing the status of any given frog and a lot more to do with just imparting a human understanding of organization upon these animals. And I don't mean human organization as though this is a natural proclivity in humans to organize everything and give them names and subcategorize them and like, no. I'm just saying this is something some humans do, and that has then been done to the natural world. Like, what even is the natural world? I mean, we've got to take this all away. What the hell is the natural world? Isn't everything natural? What could not be the natural world? Is nature just something that is created as a chaotic antithesis to civilization, to structure, to then elevate structure in its superiority? I don't know. I don't know anything. Who knows? All the deviations, ruptures, and disruptions found in any field reveal that its intelligibility is not owed to its rational and systematic cohesion, but to the confluence of forces delimiting its conduct and training people to recognize it. So you got to think of the price of entry here for any of these fields. You got to get all the degrees, you got to learn all the right language, you got to, you want to study philosophy, you got to read the Greeks, apparently. You got to read Descartes, apparently, as though philosophy starts and ends with its roots, which is like, my God, a big, big. I'm not a fan of that at all. I think that we got to do away with that. But this is a sign of the kind of policing that happens in the philosophical discursive field. What is required knowledge? What do you have to know to even be taken seriously in that field? Is it going to include indigenous knowledges? Indigenous insights that rival those of Plato and Aristotle but weren't taken seriously? Or not even indigenous in, for example, the Arab world? Many of these insights were coming, or in the Vedic tradition in India, for example, in Indian philosophy. Like, you see, why are some of these ideas included? Why are some of them not? How does their proximity to European life and culture influence whether or not they'll be taken seriously? And how does that reveal that this field is hardly this neutral representation of the history of thought, that is philosophy, and more the representation of a certain history of thought, certain European history of thought? And that puts us here into chapter 6, the formation of strategies. One of the effects of these specific organizations of knowledge and discourse is the search for originals, or universals. So in the 18th century, grammarians believed in one unifying language common to all languages. Physiocrats believed all value being located in agriculture and the land, etc. They loved to look for these universals, like the universal language that underwrites all languages. This is kind of a Platonic thing, where Plato is like, what is the idea of the chair? That, I don't think that's the example he gives. It might be the table. I don't remember. But like, we know what a chair is. If I say the word chair, probably you come up with a different mental image than I do. But there's something universal there. What is the true idea of the chair that unites these two different things? And that's kind of what discursive fields are doing. They impose a universal upon different things to categorize them, to clump them together, to make them then an object of study. Now, in his previous analyses before this book, with Madness and Civilization, The Order of Things, Birth of the Clinic, he too readily focused on the consistencies in certain discourses to grapple with their exclusionary effects, which this book is partly his effort to undo that naivete that he deployed in those previous books. So here he wants to leave room to understand other discursive strategies like incompatibilities that comprise discursive fields, yet do not compromise those fields' integrity. Don't compromise. Did I say comprise? Don't compromise their structure. So how a field can welcome newness without compromising its structure. It's a very mysterious thing, yet fields are doing it all the time. That's how they remain relevant. That's how they move. That's how they develop. So also, we must account for the ways that discursive fields interact with one another, how they complement one another, how they oppose one another, how fields emerge from others, etc. For example, how psychiatry and organic chemistry split into separate fields in the 18th and 19th centuries. Foucault stresses that this has little to do with new discoveries or knowledge, and more to do with a change in the principle of exclusion and the principle of the possibility of choices. Like, there was a time when philosophy and math and astronomy were all studied together. But now, the scientists look down upon the philosophers. And the philosophers, thinking that they are mightier, look down upon the scientists. That's a joke. But in any case, we see that there's this splitting always going on that demonstrates these acts of exclusion, of excluding various ideas, excluding various fields from one another. And also, discourse, as it crystallizes into or belongs to an intelligible field, never really just exists as discourse. Its coherence comes together in its practice and negotiation outside of discourse. Discourse on the economy owes a great debt to workers and capitalists practicing economics in new ways in the 17th and 18th centuries. Like, for a discourse to emerge, a discursive field, it's largely going to be inspired by real material things happening in the world, which are then often erased. Like workers' struggles, often erased. like union struggles, often historically erased in favor of all the triumphs of capitalist enterprise and the horrors that communism has always posed, or how it has always haunted capitalist industry. So considering all this, one will only be able to identify and delimit a field when they have traced how points of diffraction divide or derive from one another, regulate one another. Example, how the establishment of an idea of value within political economy allows discussion or science of prices to take place, or how the field corresponds to a general discursive constellation that makes the field relevant and intelligible, and how the field relates to the world, people, and comes to affect and be affected by those people, while often erasing them and their contributions. And that puts us here into chapter 7, which we'll conclude with just briefly, just remarks and consequences. To wrap up the groundwork into the study of discourse and knowledge, Foucault stresses that regularity is not imposed from outside of discourse by way of force. It is internal to discourse itself. Discourse is performing these regulative operations by its own internal logic, because that's how it exists as a discursive field. It has these mechanisms in place that carefully delimit what can belong to it. If you're clever, though, if you're a clever person, you might ask, are you, Foucault, are you not mirroring the practices you describe in your search for unities that don't really exist? I mean, for Foucault to perform this study at all, he's doing the same thing that he's criticizing them for. He's saying there's this thing called psychopathology, with a clear, stable subject called the mad person or the mentally ill, or a study of political economy or so on. Isn't he mirroring the same mechanisms that he's describing? And aren't you creating just another discourse about discourse itself, a field to study other fields? Is that not what he's doing here? In trying to open up discourse analysis, he's just offering us another field. May as well be another sociology that he's doing here. And he's totally clear, like, to this possible charge. He's like, yeah, I need to. There's no other way for me to engage in this kind of discussion unless I adopt the very same approach that I'm criticizing here, with the point being of welcoming newness or recognizing the kinds of limits that are placed within this discourse so that they can be undone and perpetually challenged. He harbors no illusions about this. It might actually be necessary to illustrate regularities, strategies, and hierarchies found in discourse. And yeah, that'll wrap that up. Is there anything I got wrong? Anything I excluded? I'd love to hear about it. It's obviously very dense stuff. I hope I've been able to demystify it. I know these episodes will probably be a little longer than normal. I wanted to keep them neat, where each episode is covering each part of the book. So I'm not doing like some of part 3 in this episode. So yeah, I hope that that's been useful. And if you like what I did, you can like, share, subscribe, and leave a review if you can. That'd be cool. And on that note, take care.